friends, colleagues, and all of you who strive to understand the deeper meanings behind the headlines, welcome. Tonight, we face a story that is not merely about rockets or borders, not merely about war and retaliation. It is about a turning point in global history. Imagine this Yemen, one of the poorest countries on earth, unleashing a staggering barrage. 1,000 Chinese made missiles, and in doing so, shaking the very foundation of Israel's military might, shaking the regional balance of power, and perhaps more importantly, shaking the global order itself. Let's be clear from the outset, this is not simply about one military strike. This is a statement, a lesson, and a revelation. Why? Because for decades the world has been told that certain nations, backed by superpower alliances, money, and nuclear weapons were untouchable. Yet today, a coalition led by Yemen, armed with Chinese technology, has shattered that myth. When 1,000 missiles rain down and obliterate strategic defenses, we are forced to ask, what does power mean in the 21st century? Now, let me put a hook right here. What we are witnessing is not only the decline of Israel's strategic invincibility, but also the exposure of the vulnerability of U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. Israel, we have been told for decades, is the iron wall, the unsinkable fortress, the regional giant. But when the poorest of the poor can deliver the deadliest of blows, then every alliance, every empire, every balance of power begins to crumble. That is the reality we must confront tonight. And yet, there is more. Think of the Chinese dimension here. These were not Yemeni engineered missiles. They were Chinese-made, technologically advanced, strategically supplied, and delivered in quantities that defy the imagination. This signals something profound. China is no longer a silent observer in the Middle East. It is stepping onto the stage, not with rhetoric, but with weaponry, with influence, and with partnerships that challenge U.S. and Western dominance in the region. The fact that Yemen, of all places, became the front line in this shift tells us everything about how globalization, technology, and resistance movements are reshaping geopolitics. Let me pose a question to you. What happens when Washington's billions in military aid to Israel cannot stop 1,000 missiles from shattering its defenses? What happens when Iron Dome, Arrow, and David Sling, all the celebrated defense systems, are overwhelmed in a single night? The answer is simple. The aura of invincibility is gone, and when invincibility disappears, fear takes its place. This is not just a story of Yemen versus Israel. It is a story of the global South versus the global North, a story of resistance against empire, a story of technology leveling the playing field. It is also a story about economics, because every missile launched, every defense destroyed, every system exposed represents billions in costs and losses. Yemen has spent a fraction, Israel and its allies have lost immeasurably more. This asymmetry is not just military, it is economic, political, and moral. But I want to draw you in deeper. Ask yourself, what will Washington do now? What will Europe say? What does this mean for Arab neighbors who have signed normalization agreements with Israel? When the streets of Cairo, Amman, and Riyadh see Yemen standing tall while Israel falters, public opinion shifts, governments wobble, and legitimacy cracks wide open. And in that vacuum, movements grow. So, my friends, here is the ultimate hook. This is not the end of a battle. It is the beginning of a transformation. We are living through the unraveling of a global order that has dictated who is strong and who is weak, who matters and who does not. And if Yemen can send 1,000 missiles to obliterate Israel's defenses, then no empire, no hegemon, no superpower should feel safe. Yemen's unprecedented strike of launching 1,000 Chinese made missiles against Israel has become one of the most dramatic and shocking developments in modern warfare, not merely because of the scale, but because of what it represents in terms of power, politics, and the fragile balance of security in the Middle East. For years, observers, analysts, and governments have spoken of Yemen as the poorest of the poor, a nation battered by war, famine, and economic collapse, incapable of challenging even its immediate neighbors, let alone Israel, which has been regarded as the military giant of the region. Yet, in one decisive night, that perception was shattered, and the world now faces the haunting reality that even those written off as powerless can strike with devastating effect. Imagine the sound, the fear, the sky lit with fire as 1,000 rockets tore through defenses designed and celebrated as impenetrable. This was not just an attack. It was a demonstration of resolve, of endurance, and of a willingness to take risks that no one thought possible. The first hook that demands our attention is the sheer scale of the attack. Never before in Israel's history has it faced a concentrated barrage of this magnitude. We are not talking about a handful of rockets fired sporadically, as has often been the case from resistance groups in Gaza or Lebanon. We are talking about a coordinated, synchronized, and technologically advanced strike that saturated every layer of Israel's defense. To put it in perspective, Israel's Iron Dome, Arrow, and David's sling systems were engineered for efficiency against hundreds of incoming threats, but 1,000 missiles, many of them maneuverable and guided, represent a level of intensity those systems were never prepared for. The result was predictable system overload, interception failures, and catastrophic hits on infrastructure, military bases, and symbolic targets that Israelis once thought untouchable. What makes this development even more extraordinary is that it comes from Yemen, a country whose image globally has been that of a humanitarian crisis zone, not a rising military power. For years, Western policymakers dismissed Yemen as a place of chaos, a pawn in larger conflicts between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and global players, and yet this strike forces us to rethink how could a nation so impoverished, so marginalized, so scared by war, harness the ability to organize and deliver such a devastating blow. The answer lies in the alliances and the geopolitical shifts that have been quietly unfolding. Chinese-made weaponry, advanced technology, and external support have turned Yemen into a proving ground, a place where the underdog suddenly learned to punch far above its weight. Another hook lies in the psychological impact. For decades, Israel has maintained its aura of invincibility, an identity it cultivated to deter enemies and reassure allies. This aura has been vital not only to its military security, but also to its political leverage in the region. After all, if Israel cannot be touched, then its deterrent power is supreme. But 1,000 missiles breaking through in a single night has dealt an almost irreversible blow to that perception. When the world sees images of cities under fire, of defense systems overwhelmed, of leaders caught unprepared, the myth collapses, and myths, once broken, cannot be easily restored. We must also consider the asymmetry in cost and resources. Yemen, spending a fraction of what Israel invests annually in its military, delivered damage worth billions in destruction, panic, and loss of confidence. For Israel and its Western backers, this raises uncomfortable questions. How can billions of dollars in cutting-edge defense be rendered nearly useless by one of the poorest nations on earth? This imbalance is not just military, it is symbolic. It tells smaller nations and resistance movements around the world that power is no longer monopolized by wealth or alliances. Determination, creativity, and the right technology can tilt the scales in ways previously unthinkable. And then comes the broader hook, the ripple effect on the region and beyond. This was not merely a missile strike, it was a wake-up call. It reverberates in Washington, where policymakers must now confront the possibility that U.S. investments and guarantees are not enough to secure allies. It reverberates in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, where governments that normalized relations with Israel must wonder if they tied their futures to a faltering power. It reverberates in Cairo, Amman, and Ankara, where public opinion sees Yemen, the so-called weakling, suddenly rewriting history. And it reverberates in Beijing and Moscow, who see in this moment the confirmation that multipolarity is not a distant dream, but a living reality. The ultimate question that lingers is this: if Yemen can do this, who else can follow? And if Israel can be shaken so violently, what does that mean for the broader structure of global power? That is why this attack is more than just a military strike. It is a turning point, a historical marker that forces us to rethink who truly holds power in our world today. The collapse of Israel's invincibility myth is perhaps the most profound political and psychological consequence of Yemen's massive strike. For decades, Israel carefully cultivated an image of being unassailable, of possessing military superiority so absolute that no neighboring state or movement could hope to defeat it. This reputation was not accidental. It was built through years of U.S. aid, cutting-edge weaponry, intelligence supremacy, and successful displays of power against its neighbors. The Iron Dome and other defense systems were marketed globally as technological marvels, capable of protecting the nation against waves of incoming attacks. That myth has now been cracked wide open, and in geopolitics, perception can often be more powerful than reality. Once invincibility is questioned, the deterrence value it carried begins to fade, and with it, the strategic advantage Israel enjoyed for decades. The first hook in understanding this collapse lies in the sheer vulnerability displayed during the Yemeni missile storm. Citizens of Israel, who once lived with the confidence that advanced defense layers would shield them, suddenly found themselves facing a terrifying new reality. Sirens blared across major cities, defense systems faltered under saturation, and the public witnessed explosions that contradicted every assurance leaders had made. Confidence is a currency in international relations, and when that confidence is shaken, the ripple effects extend far beyond the battlefield. Rivals see opportunity, allies see weakness, and citizens begin to doubt the promises of their leaders. Another striking element of this collapse is its symbolic impact on the Arab world and beyond. For years, Israeli officials presented their state as the region's strongest fortress, so much so that normalization agreements with Arab governments were justified on the assumption that aligning with Israel's power would bring stability and security. But when Yemen, a country written off as powerless and impoverished, successfully broke through that fortress, the symbolism was overwhelming. Across the Arab street, people who once saw Israel as untouchable now see cracks in its armor. That shift in perception emboldens resistance movements, shakes pro-Israel governments, and fuels the belief that a balance of power once thought impossible may now be within reach. A further hook emerges when we analyze how Israel's military pride, the Iron Dome, Arrow, and David's sling, was showcased to the world as undefeatable. Billions were invested not only in creating those systems, but also in marketing them as the ultimate defense solutions. They were paraded as technological superiority in action, proof that Israeli innovation and U.S. backing could guarantee safety. But when those systems failed to stop the flood of missiles, the credibility attached to them collapsed along with Israel's aura of invincibility. The message was devastating. Even the most advanced technology can be rendered ineffective under pressure. This is a lesson not just for Israel, but for all nations that rely too heavily on the myth of technological supremacy. We must also recognize that invincibility is not just military, it is political and psychological. Israel's ability to deter its adversaries was built on fear, on the assumption that any challenge would be crushed swiftly and decisively. That fear has now been diluted. The perception of weakness invites more challenges, more daring moves by those who once would have held back. It also undermines the confidence of the Israeli public itself, who may now begin questioning whether their government has the capacity to truly defend them. This erosion of trust can destabilize politics from within, making it harder for leaders to project strength abroad. The global reaction adds another layer to this collapse. Allies in Washington and Europe, who have tied their credibility to Israel's security, must now grapple with the fact that billions in aid and diplomatic cover cannot guarantee the outcome they promised. This damages not only Israel's reputation, but also the broader narrative of Western dominance. If the strongest U.S.-backed ally in the Middle East can be shaken so badly, then other U.S. guarantees in the region appear less credible. That perception, once seeded, spreads quickly, and adversaries everywhere take note. The final hook is this: myths of invincibility rarely die quietly. They collapse suddenly under the weight of undeniable evidence, and once gone, they leave a vacuum. Israel now stands at such a juncture. The Yemeni strike was more than a military event. It was a rewriting of regional psychology. The fortress is no longer unbreachable, the aura no longer unquestioned. And in geopolitics, once that aura fades, it can never be fully rebuilt. The use of Chinese-made missiles in Yemen's massive strike against Israel introduces a game-changing dimension that extends far beyond the battlefield. It was not simply that missiles were fired, it was that they bore the imprint of a global power entering a regional conflict with quiet but undeniable force. For years, the Middle East has been a stage dominated by the United States and its Western allies, with Russia occasionally playing a supporting role. China, by contrast, positioned itself as an economic partner, a builder of infrastructure, a merchant of trade through its Belt and Road Initiative. But this attack revealed a new reality. Beijing's influence is no longer confined to commerce and diplomacy. Its weaponry, its technology, and by extension its strategic presence have made a dramatic entrance, signaling a reshaping of the global chessboard. The hook here is clear. When Chinese missiles devastate Israel's defenses, it is not only Yemen that speaks, it is China's shadow extending into the heart of the Middle East. One of the most striking aspects of this development is how it exposes the shifting balance of global alliances. For decades, the U.S. monopoly on supplying arms to its allies gave Washington unparalleled leverage. Military aid was not just about weapons, it was about loyalty, about cementing relationships through dependency. Yet, in this case, Yemen's reliance on Chinese technology disrupts that pattern. The fact that Chinese arms could bypass U.S.-backed systems and overwhelm them undermines American dominance. This raises a provocative question. If Chinese missiles can achieve what U.S. systems could not prevent, how long before other nations begin looking east instead of west for their security guarantees? That is the deeper hook, the beginning of an exodus from American military reliance. Another layer of this moment comes from China's deliberate ambiguity. Beijing has not publicly declared itself as a military backer of Yemen, nor has it openly claimed responsibility for the deployment of these weapons. And yet the evidence of origin is undeniable. This kind of strategic silence is part of China's long game, stepping into influence not with chest-thumping declarations, but with quiet effectiveness. Every missile that slammed into Israeli defenses carried a message louder than any speech. China's presence is here, and it works. This creates a new dilemma for Washington. How can the U.S. counter an influence that expands not through occupation or bombast, but through the subtle, undeniable delivery of capability? There is also an economic hook in this story. The arms industry is not merely about warfare, it is about markets, contracts, and political leverage. If Chinese weapons demonstrate superior